Today we're going to take a second look at factoring. So let's start with this warm-up. Let's say we had two numbers, x times y equals 0. What values of x or y would make this true? So let you think about that. You could have several answers for this question that would be true. X could be any number. But if x was any number, then to get y would have to be 0. And you can go the other way around. If x is 0, y can be any number. And the reason is anything times 0 is 0. How about this question? If x minus 2 times y equals 0, what values of x or y would make this true? Well, again, we can think back to what we did before. Let's say y is 0. X can be any number. But now you have this part right here, x minus 2. Well, x minus 2, that can be 0. And then y can be any number. Well, if x minus 2 is 0, we can solve that and we can get x. So let's do that. Let's add 2 to each side. And if we do that, if x is 2, 2 minus 2 is 0, and then you have the 0 here, so that when y is any number, you get 0. So here x can be 2, and y can be any number. Let's try another one. X minus 2 times y plus 3 equals 0. Well, x minus 2 can be 0, and we just solved that. If you add 2 to each side of x is 2, this factor is 0. So then y can be any number. What about this? Y plus 3, what makes that 0? Subtract 3 from each side. So if y is negative 3, then x can be any number. All right, we're going to factor to find the zeros and then sketch the function for this one right here. Oops. All right, so factor, then sketch. So let's factor this. If you use a box and circle, you have x squared minus 3x minus 10. What numbers multiply to negative 10x squared that add to negative 3x? That would be negative 5x and 2x. So if we factor, we'll get x minus 5, x plus 2. So here's the first step factor. X plus 2, x minus 5 equals 0. All right, let's solve. Well, for this right here, this whole thing can be 0. If x plus 2 equals 0, x can be negative 2. And x can be anything, or if x is negative 2, the whole thing will be 0. What makes this factor 0? Well, if we add 5 to each side, if x is 5, the whole thing will be 0 as well. So there's two answers here, and let's sketch this function. If there's an x squared, what shape will it be? Well, your answer should have been a parabola. Let's find where x is negative 2 and where x is 5. And if we sketch this function, whoops, try that again. And the graph crosses x equals 0 at negative 2 and at 5. So there's a sketch. Let's do it for the next function. All right, this one's slightly different. We want to get 0 on one side because we're trying to find where x is 0. So the first step is add 12 to each side. You have x squared plus 8x equals, plus 12 equals 0. Our next step is we're going to factor. We can use the box and circle. We have x squared, 8x, and 12. So what multiplies to 12x squared, that adds to 8x. And the answer would be 6x and 2x. So we factor that. we'll get x and x plus 6 plus 2. And here's our factored form. All right, so if this is 0, we can split this up. What makes x plus 2 equal to 0? Well, x could be negative 2, so that would work. Let's try this one. X plus 6 equals 0. Subtract 6 from each side. X equals negative 6. So there's two answers here. Again, it's a parabola, that's why there's two answers. And we want a graph where x is 0. So here's what your function could look like. Graph, arrows. Okay, so where x is negative 2, there's a 0 and negative 6. We change colors. So here's what our parabola might look like where you have the zeros. Okay. Here's one more, and we'll start relating it to why we're learning this. So this one right here, we'd have to pull out something first. What number or letter can we pull out of each of these? That would be an x. X squared plus 5x plus 4 equals 0. You're going to factor this, so you can use a box and circle, and you would get what multiplies to 4x squared that adds to 5x. That would be x plus 4, x plus 1. All right, what makes this 0? Well, if x is 0, the whole thing's 0. If x is negative 4, the whole thing is 0. And if x is negative 1, the whole thing is 0. So if we sketch this graph, all right, so negative 4. Let's change colors. So 0, negative 1, negative 4. And if you graph this function, it looks something. Oops. I just can't get that 0. It looks something like this, where you have the zeros. So here are our answers, and here's the graph. All right, one more factoring. This one right here, use a box and circle to factor. We can't, well actually we can pull out a term here. We can pull the 2. We use a box and circle to factor. I've done that ahead of time, so this would be x plus 2, x plus 1. And when you solve, the 2 doesn't matter. But what makes this factor 0? Negative 2. What makes this factor 0? Negative 1. So if we were to sketch this function, it would look something like this. Question: what's the difference between these two? One is factor, one is solve. Well, here's the difference. You can factor each one of them. If you factor them, it multiplies to negative 3. That adds to negative 2. So again, you'd use your box and circle. And it would be x minus 3, x plus 1 for each of them. But here you're done. This is factored. But here we have the equals 0. So we do have to solve, and there's two answers. So solving, you get answers, and factoring, you just have factored form. Let's tie it all together. This problem we looked at yesterday. Let's say a ball is thrown straight up from 3 meters above the ground with a velocity of 14 meters a second. When does it hit the ground? All right, so here is the height, 3. Here's the upwards velocity, 14 meters a second. And in meters per second, things fall at a rate of negative 5 meters per second squared. Draw the situation. So the height over time starts at 3, and then it goes down. How can we solve this? All right, so here's that function, that equation. Here's the equation that we want to solve. Negative 5t squared plus 14t plus 3 equals 0. And here's the height, 0. And we're trying to find out what time is the height 0. So we're going to factor. Let's use a box and circle for this. Negative 5t squared, 14t, 3. So what multiplies to negative 15t squared that adds to 14t? Well, that would be 15t and 1t. All right, so now let's factor the outside. Let's put a negative 5 here. It'll be easier to get this 15. So negative 5t and t. T times 1 is 1t. T times negative 3 is negative 15t. So here's the factored form. I'm going to write this on a new page. Okay, here's the factored form. We can actually solve this. So this one, subtract 1 from each side. Oh, did I put my negative in the wrong spot? Oh, I did put my negative in the wrong spot. I apologize. So this should have been a negative here. And we'll make that positive. This will be positive. Okay, so that changes my answer. Let's start here again. Okay, so let's rewrite it. It would be 5t plus 1. It would be t negative t plus 3. Okay, this will solve. So again, 5t plus 1, what makes that 0? Subtract 1 from each side. 5t equals negative 1. Divide by 5. So t is negative 0.2. Let's do this one right here. So negative t plus 3 equals 0. Subtract 3 from each side. Negative t equals negative 3. T equals 3. So you have one negative answer and one positive answer. But in this situation, think about the picture. We're just looking at the positive. Here's the negative. It would be if you were to extend this line, that would be at negative 0.2. But here's the answer we're looking for at 3 seconds. So it takes 3 seconds before that hits the ground. So here's what I want you to think about. Use factoring. Okay, so we did that. How could you use the information we looked at today to figure out the fireworks problem, which is, here's that equation we looked at the beginning. When would the fireworks hit the ground? So again, here's your diagram of the situation. You shot them off. When would they hit the ground? Right here. Can you use the knowledge that we just covered today and solve? Can you figure out this coordinate? What does t equal right here? So think about the steps we did for the previous problems today. Factor and setting it equal to 0, and let's see if you can solve. And then your assignment will be the next worksheet. Summary. One way to find the zeros are the x-intercepts of a quadratic. So again, if we're talking about something like this, here are the zeros or the x-intercepts, is you could factor, and it's called zero product property, but set each factor equal to 0 and solve.